Before the United States existed, before borders were drawn on maps, before the word American was ever spoken, millions of native people lived across North America. They were not one culture, one tribe, or one civilization. They were thousands of nations, speaking hundreds of languages, practicing diverse religions, and living in societies that had thrived for tens of thousands of years. Yet within just a few centuries, these nations were shattered. The destruction of Native Americans was not accidental. It was systematic, deliberate, and government-sanctioned. Through broken treaties, military violence, forced displacement, starvation, religious repression, and the removal of children, indigenous peoples were stripped of their land, identity, and future. This is not ancient history. Its consequences still shape America today. Chapter 1. Life Before Colonization, a World Already Whole. Long before Europeans arrived, North America was fully inhabited. Native societies included the Iroquois Confederacy, one of the world's earliest democratic systems, the Mississippian mound builders, the Pueblo civilizations, the Lakota, Cheyenne, Apache, Navajo, and hundreds more. These societies practiced sustainable agriculture, maintained complex trade networks, governed themselves through councils and laws, lived in spiritual balance with land and nature. Yet contrary to colonial myths, Native Americans were not primitive, not wandering savages, and not ownerless occupants. They had laws, territories, and sovereignty. That reality made them an obstacle. Chapter 2. European Arrival and the Beginning of Erasure. When Europeans arrived in the late 1400s, they brought more than ships and religion. They brought disease, greed, and racial ideology. Smallpox, measles, and influenza devastated native populations. Some estimates suggest up to 90% of indigenous people died from disease alone in the first centuries of contact. But disease alone did not destroy Native America. What followed was intentional policy. European settlers believed the land was theirs by divine right. Indigenous people were inferior. Native resistance justified extermination. This ideology would later be formalized as manifest destiny. Chapter 3. Treaties, Promises Made to be Broken. Between the 1700s and late 1800s, the U.S. government signed over 370 treaties with native nations. Every single one was broken. Treaties promised permanent land ownership, peace and protection, sovereignty and self-rule. In reality, treaties were tools of deception. When gold was discovered, treaties were ignored. When settlers demanded land, treaties were erased. When native people resisted, the army was sent. Treaties were signed under coercion, starvation, or military threat. Many tribes didn't even understand the language they were signing in. The U.S. Supreme Court later acknowledged that treaties were violated, yet almost none were honored. Chapter 4. Forced Removal and the Trail of Tears. One of the most infamous acts of ethnic cleansing in U.S. history was the Indian Removal Act of 1830, signed by President Andrew Jackson. This law authorized the forced removal of native tribes from their ancestral lands east of the Mississippi, rivers to territories in the West. The result was mass death. The Trail of Tears. The Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole nations were forcibly marched hundreds of miles. They were chained, starved, exposed to winter conditions, denied medical care. Over 15,000 native people died during these marches. The land they were removed from became plantations, towns, and cities built on native graves. Chapter 5. Wars of Extermination. As settlers moved west, conflict intensified. The U.S. Army waged decades of wars against Native nations. Sand Creek Massacre in 1864, Washita Massacre in 1868, Wounded Knee Massacre in 1890. These were not battles, they were slaughters. Women, children, and elders were targeted deliberately. Villages were burned, food supplies destroyed. Military leaders openly described their mission as extermination. As one U.S. general stated, "Kill every buffalo you can. Every buffalo dead is an Indian gone." Chapter 7. Reservations, Open-Air Prisons. Reservations were not safe havens, they were controlled zones of containment. Native people were confined to poor land, denied freedom of movement, controlled by federal agents, dependent on government rations. Traditional governments was replaced by U.S. authority. Resistance was punished. Culture was criminalized. Poverty, alcoholism, and despair followed, not by accident, but by design. Chapter 8. Boarding Schools, Kill the Indian, Save the Man. Perhaps the most brutal act of cultural genocide came through boarding schools. Beginning in the late 1800s, Native children were forcibly taken from their families and placed in government-run or church-run schools. Their purpose was clear. The founder of the system, Richard Henry Pratt, stated, "Kill the Indian in him and save the man." Children were beaten for speaking their language, forced to cut their hair, given Christian names, taught to hate their identity. Thousands died from disease, abuse, and neglect. This was not education, it was psychological warfare. Chapter 9. Cultural Genocide and Identity Destruction. Native religions were banned, ceremonies were outlawed, languages were erased. Children returned home unable to speak to their parents. Trauma passed from generation to generation. This created intergenerational trauma, loss of cultural continuity, identity crises. The goal was not assimilation, it was elimination of indigenous existence as a people. Chapter 10. Resistance and Survival. Despite everything, Native Americans did not disappear. They resisted through armed struggle, through legal battles, through cultural survival. Today, Native nations are reclaiming language, land, and identity, but the scars remain. Poverty, addiction, suicide rates, and land disputes are direct results of historical trauma. Chapter 11. Law as a Weapon, When Courts Legalized Theft. After military conquest and forced removals, the U.S. government turned to a quieter but equally destructive tool, the legal system. In theory, the Supreme Court recognized Native tribes as domestic dependent nations. In reality, this status stripped them of true sovereignty while denying them full rights. The Doctrine of Discovery. One of the most damaging legal concepts ever applied to Native Americans was the doctrine of discovery, a European Christian belief that land not occupied by Christians could be claimed by Christian nations. This doctrine became the foundation of U.S. property law. It declared that Native people could live on the land, but they could never truly own it. Ultimate ownership belonged to the U.S. government. This legal fiction transformed entire continents into stolen property without ever acknowledging the crime. Chapter 12. The Dawes Act, Breaking Tribes from the Inside. In 1887, the U.S. government passed the Dawes Act, a law designed to destroy tribal unity. Communal tribal lands were divided into individual plots. Native families received small parcels. Excess land was sold to white settlers. The results were catastrophic. Within decades, Native Americans lost over 90 million acres of land. Tribal governance collapsed. Poverty deepened. The Dawes Act was not about helping Native people farm. It was about erasing collective identity, replacing tribal life with isolation and dependence. Chapter 13. Criminalizing Native Identity. By the late 19th century, being Native American itself became a crime. The U.S. government banned traditional dances, religious ceremonies, spiritual leaders, healing practices. Practicing one's own culture could result in imprisonment or starvation through withheld rations. The ghost dance, a peaceful spiritual movement promising renewal and healing, terrified federal authorities. Their response was violence. Chapter 14. Wounded Knee, the End of Armed Resistance. In December 1910, U.S. troops surrounded a Lakota camp at Wounded Knee Creek. The Lakota were disarmed. A gunshot rang out, its origin still unknown. What followed was a massacre. Over 300 Lakota men, women, and children were slaughtered. Bodies froze in the snow. Infants were shot. Elders hunted down as they fled. The U.S. Army awarded Medals of Honor for this massacre. Wounded Knee marked the symbolic end of Native armed resistance, but not the end of suffering. Chapter 15. Children Taken, Futures Destroyed. After military defeat, the government intensified its focus on Native children. Families were threatened with prison or starvation if they refused to surrender their children to boarding schools. Children as young as 4 years old were taken hundreds of miles away. Many never came home. Inside the schools, abuse was routine. Death was common. Silence was enforced. Survivors described these schools as worse than prisons. Chapter 16. Psychological Warfare and Intergenerational Trauma. The damage inflicted by boarding schools did not end when children returned home. Many could not speak their native language, had forgotten their culture, had internalized shame. They returned traumatized, disconnected, and often unable to parent in healthy ways. This trauma passed from generation to generation, what scholars now call intergenerational trauma. The pain did not fade with time, it multiplied. Chapter 17. Economic Destruction and Forced Dependency. Native economies were deliberately dismantled. Traditional trade networks were destroyed, hunting grounds were eliminated, farming lands were confiscated. Reservations were often located on arid land, resource-poor regions, isolated areas. The government then blamed Native communities for poverty it had engineered. Dependency was not an accident, it was policy. Chapter 18. Sterilization and Population Control. In the 20th century, the destruction took a new form, forced sterilization. Thousands of Native women were sterilized without consent in government hospitals during the 1960s and 1970s. Some were told it was reversible, others were never informed at all. This was a continuation of genocide, quiet, bureaucratic, and devastating. Chapter 19. Media Erasure and Historical Lies. American history books rarely told the truth. Native Americans were portrayed as savages, obstacles to progress, a vanishing race. Movies, cartoons, and textbooks erased genocide and replaced it with myths of heroic conquest. This cultural distortion allowed violence to be forgotten and repeated. Chapter 20. Modern Struggles. The past is not over. Today, Native Americans face highest poverty rates in the U.S., disproportionate incarceration, limited access to health care, ongoing land disputes. Many reservations lack clean water. Suicide rates remain alarmingly high. These are not coincidences, they are consequences. Chapter 21. Resistance Reborn. Despite everything, Native resistance never died. From the American Indian movement, occupation of Alcatraz, Standing Rock protests, Native people continue to fight for sovereignty, land, and dignity.
Languages are being revived, ceremonies restored, identity reclaimed. Survival itself is resistance.
Chapter 22. When resistance became a national threat. By the mid-20th century, Native Americans were no longer seen merely as a conquered people. They were now viewed as a potential political threat. As Native activism grew, the U.S. government responded not with dialogue, but with surveillance. Federal monitoring of Native movements. Organizations like the American Indian Movement, AIM, were infiltrated by federal agencies. Leaders were monitored, harassed, arrested, or discredited. Native activism, focused on treaty rights, land reclamation, and sovereignty, was treated as subversion. The message was clear. Native resistance would not be tolerated. Chapter 23. Wounded Knee, 1973. History repeats itself. In 1973, Lakota activists occupied Wounded Knee, the site of the 1890 massacre. Their demands were simple: recognition of treaty rights, investigation of corruption, respect for sovereignty. The response was overwhelming force. Federal agents surrounded the town for 71 days. Gunfire echoed across the same land where ancestors had been slaughtered decades earlier. Once again, the United States chose guns over justice. Chapter 24. Environmental Genocide. Poisoned lands, poisoned people. One of the least discussed forms of modern genocide against Native Americans is environmental destruction. Uranium mining and nuclear sacrifice zones. During the Cold War, uranium was mined extensively on native land, especially on Navajo territory. Workers were not informed of the risks. The result? Cancer clusters, birth defects, contaminated water, permanent land damage. Entire communities became sacrifice zones for national security. Chapter 25. Oil, Pipelines, and Broken Promises. In the 21st century, native land continues to be treated as expendable. Pipelines, drilling projects, and mining operations are routinely approved without tribal consent. Standing Rock and the Dakota Access Pipeline. In 2016, the world watched as native water protectors protested the Dakota Access Pipeline. They were met with militarized police, rubber bullets, water cannons in freezing temperatures, mass arrests, all for defending their water. The slogan was simple: "Water is life." The response was violence. Chapter 26. Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, MMWI. One of the most horrifying modern crises facing Native communities is the epidemic of missing and murdered Indigenous women. Native women are murdered at rates far higher than any other group, often ignored by law enforcement, frequently misclassified in official records. Jurisdictional confusion between federal, state, and tribal authorities creates a system where perpetrators walk free. This is not neglect, it is systemic indifference. Chapter 27. Policing, Prisons, and Racial Targeting. Native Americans are disproportionately incarcerated. Many reservations are heavily policed, yet crimes against Native people go unresolved. The justice system often fails Native victims while aggressively prosecuting Native defendants. Justice, once again, is unevenly applied. Chapter 28. Healthcare as a Broken Promise. The Indian Health Service, IHS, was created as part of treaty obligations. In reality, it has been chronically underfunded. Native communities face limited hospitals, long wait times, shortage of specialists,
high rates of preventable disease. Treaties promised care. What was delivered was neglect. Chapter 29. Education, Poverty, and Structural Barriers. Schools on reservations are often underfunded, overcrowded, and outdated. Economic opportunity is scarce, not due to lack of talent, but lack of investment. Native communities are blamed for conditions imposed upon them. This cycle of blame masks the original crime. Chapter 30. Language Loss, a Second Death. Languages carry memory, worldview, and identity. Hundreds of native languages have gone extinct. Each lost language represents lost history, lost knowledge, lost identity. Language suppression was intentional. Revival is an act of defiance. Chapter 31. Spiritual Survival in a Secular State. Native spirituality survived underground. For decades, sacred ceremonies were illegal. Even today, sacred sites are destroyed for development. Religion was once used to justify conquest. Now it is ignored to justify destruction. Chapter 32. The Myth of Equality. America often claims that Native Americans are now equal citizens, but equality without justice is illusion. When land is stolen, culture erased, and trauma inherited, legal equality means little. The playing field was never level. Chapter 33. Why this history is still hidden. This story is uncomfortable. It contradicts national myths of freedom and progress, so it is minimized, sanitized, forgotten. Silence becomes a form of violence. Chapter 34. Survival is resistance. Despite everything, Native Americans endure. They reclaim language, ceremony, identity, land. Every song sung, every child taught their language, every treaty remembered is resistance. Chapter 35. A genocide without an apology. Unlike many nations that have formally acknowledged their crimes, the United States has never fully admitted to committing genocide against Native Americans. There has been no National Truth Commission, no official apology backed by reparations, no systematic return of stolen land. What exists instead are symbolic gestures, statements without consequences. The word genocide is carefully avoided, even though the evidence fits its definition: the intentional destruction of a people through killing, displacement, cultural erasure, and prevention of future generations. Silence protects myths. Truth threatens power. Chapter 36. Why acknowledgement has always been resisted. Acknowledging genocide would force the United States to confront uncomfortable realities: that American prosperity was built on stolen land, that democracy expanded alongside ethnic cleansing, that treaties are still legally binding. Recognition would raise dangerous questions: who truly owns the land? Who owes restitution? Who benefits from forgetting? So history is softened, language is diluted, responsibility is scattered across time. Chapter 37. The Cost of Denial. Denial is not neutral, it causes harm. When genocide is denied, trauma remains unresolved, systems of inequality persist, violence becomes normalized. Native communities continue to suffer not because of the past alone, but because the past is unacknowledged. Healing cannot begin where truth is rejected. Chapter 38. What justice could look like. Justice does not mean revenge, it means responsibility. True justice could include legal enforcement of existing treaties, land return or land sharing agreements, full funding of healthcare and education as promised, protection of sacred sites, recognition of tribal sovereignty. These are not gifts, they are obligations. Chapter 40. Reparations, the unspoken word. Reparations are often dismissed as unrealistic or divisive, yet the United States has paid reparations before to others. Native Americans, whose land funded the nation itself, remain excluded from serious discussion. Reparations are not charity, they are repair. Chapter 41. The fight for land, the heart of everything. Land is not symbolic to Native nations. It is identity, history, and survival. From Black Hills disputes to pipeline resistance, land remains the central conflict. As long as land is treated as a commodity rather than a living relationship, conflict will continue. Chapter 42. Cultural Revival, Undoing Erasure. Despite centuries of suppression, Native cultures are rising again. Across the continent, languages are being revived, ceremonies are returning, traditional knowledge is being taught, youth are reclaiming identity. Every reclaimed word is an act of resistance. Every remembered song defies genocide. Chapter 44. Youth, Memory, and the Battle for the Future. Native youth carry both trauma and strength. They inherit the pain of stolen history, the resilience of survival. Education, representation, and opportunity are not luxuries, they are lifelines. The future of Native America depends on memory without despair. Chapter 43. Media, Truth, and Responsibility. Storytelling shapes reality. For too long, Native Americans were portrayed as relics of the past. Now, Native filmmakers, writers, and activists are reclaiming the narrative. Truth is finally being spoken, often by those who were silenced first. Chapter 44. What America Must Learn. This history is not only Native history, it is American history. Understanding genocide does not weaken a nation, it matures it. A country that cannot face its past cannot shape a just future. Chapter 45. Survival is not the end goal. Native Americans did not fight for centuries simply to survive. They fought for dignity, sovereignty, continuity. Survival was the beginning, not the victory. Chapter 46. The Meaning of Reconciliation. Reconciliation is not forgetting. It is remembering without denial, listening without defensiveness, acting without delay. It requires courage, not comfort. Chapter 47. The Final Truth. The destruction of Native Americans was intentional, systematic, profitable. It was carried out through laws, schools, armies, and silence. Yet it failed in one crucial way. Native people are still here. Final Con. From broken treaties to forced marches, from boarding schools to poisoned land, from silence to denial, this story is not over. Native Americans endure not because the system was kind, but because resistance was stronger than erasure. The land remembers, the people remember, history remembers, and remembrance is the first step towards justice.